Fresh off the DNC convention, no Jewish students were given a platform to speak, and no mention of skyrocketing levels of anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is surging among Jewish voters. Don't go away. We'll be right back with special guest Shabbos Kestenbaum. Welcome to Alan Scorched Reports. I'm Alan Scorched. This past week, we in America and around the world watched the Democratic National Convention officially nominate Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to challenge Donald Trump and J.D. Vance this coming November. This will be the first election in history where the issue of combating anti-Semitism and support for Israel versus the forces of evil are squarely on the ballot. Following the October 7th invasion and massacre of over 1,000 civilians and the kidnapping of over 240 Jews, Israelis, Americans, and citizens from over 20 countries, from infants to senior citizens, have the lines between good and evil and moral against immoral been so stark. From the streets of America and college campuses, Jews have never been under more direct threat since 1930s Germany. Today, we are honored to have with us a rising Jewish rock star, Shabbos Kestenbaum. And while Shabbos is a term associated with the day of rest, Shabbos Kestenbaum never rests when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. You've seen him all over cable news, often on Fox News, following his becoming the lead plaintiff against Harvard University for their failure to protect Jewish students against pervasive campus anti-Semitism. He has also testified before Congress many times. He lectures on Jewish communal issues, and he brought the House down at the Republican National Convention. Shabbos, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Okay, so first, again, I've seen you all over the cable news networks, but never before when you were at the RNC and the way you were positioned, the way you were standing with such pride and such force with your yarmulke showing, did you speak so passionately about the war right now against Jews and college anti-Semitism. So if you would, can you walk us through how the Republican convention, how they got a hold of you, what it was like being there, how they treated you, how the crowd there treated you, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So the story of how I got asked actually isn't that exciting, unfortunately. I was actually driving on the way to the Hamptons. I was speaking at a pro-Israel rally. And quite literally, I just got a phone call from a woman at the Trump campaign saying that they were actually following my story for a number of months, and they were interested in exploring the opportunity of coming to speak at the RNC. So I had a follow-up call with them a week later, and this is really 10, 15 days before the RNC. I mean, it's kind of down to the wire. And we discussed what I would want to talk about. And there was an agreement that what is happening to all too many Jewish students across college campuses is worthy and necessary to be given a primetime speaking engagement. So I was on board from the get-go. I think anytime you are given a platform to reach millions of Americans, you do it. And in fact, I went on Fox News the day after my speech to say that if the Democrats want me to speak, I'd be more than honored to do it. I was at the Democratic Convention, which of course just ended on Thursday, and unfortunately, they didn't want any Jewish student to be platformed. They did not meaningfully address anti-Semitism. They did not articulate the policies they would implement, so that was disappointing. But in terms of the RNC, I'm incredibly grateful, not only to the Republican Party for allowing me to speak, but also for their really clear and aggressive policy positions, for their platform that articulates things like the deportation of non-American students who violate the foreign visa system and break American law, which I would remind your listeners is already American law, which is the instillment of patriotic values in our school system, which is squarely standing with the land of Israel and giving the state of Israel what it needs to defend itself and her people. So these are policies that unfortunately have become partisan, but they really shouldn't be. And I don't want anyone to get too upset, but I've been a registered Democrat since the day I turned 18. I've only voted for Democrats. And I was at the DNC to sort of make the case for Democratic lawmakers that they should adopt these common sense policies. But unfortunately, I did not get very far.
So I'll tell you also, just in a matter of full disclosure, I'm a rock-ribbed conservative Republican. However, and this is my rule though, when it comes to anti-Semitism and support for Israel, I have no party loyalty. I think Richie Torres is great. I think John Fetterman is the surprise of the year, because when he first ran, he was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, by AOC, by J Street, and we were all certain that he was going to be another, squad member, and he's been terrific. And Bob Menendez from New Jersey, a schmuck. He used to be so hawkishly pro-Israel, and he got involved with crazy things, and so now he's gone. So in that vein, I completely agree with you. But the way you spoke, first of all, again, it was very passionately, but now that you mentioned that you would have spoken at the Democrat convention, would you have used that same speech that you used at the RNC? Because I can tell you that had you spoken about deporting students who are here breaking the law, they'd have gone nuts.
Yeah, so I think number one, that's a damning indictment on the state of my party that enforcing law that's already on the books would be considered controversial. As I said, this particular law has been in place since the 1980s. I remember I was a student on a foreign visa in Israel. I was studying in a religious seminary for 2 years, and if I had broken any Israeli law, I would be sent back to the United States. That should not be controversial because that's the law. But unfortunately, it has become controversial. I would tailor my speech to really implore the party that I had grown up voting for, that I had grown up really agreeing with, imploring them to return to their roots. And my congressman is Richie Torres, who of course is a progressive, and he's staunchly pro-Israel, and he's just simply remarkable. And you mentioned John Fetterman. I think George Latimer, who just defeated Jamal Bowman in Westchester, I think he's part of that category as well. So there are Democratic rock stars. There are those who are the ideological home for me in the Democratic Party, but the party has really gone to directions that make it unrecognizable. I mean, I'm only 25, right. So I can say that just in the last 7-8 years, the party has shifted. I wouldn't even call it to the left, because what I see is not liberalism. I don't see it as progressivism. I simply see it as a, to sound like a real conservative, a woke mind virus that has taken over certainly young people who are Democrats, but also progressive politicians. And it's deeply troubling. It's deeply worrying.
Okay. So I want to touch on that, because you had mentioned in your speech that you've always voted Democrat, and that the party's become ideologically poisoned. Now, again, You're 25. So I go all the way back to the Clinton administration, when Bibi Netanyahu became the target of Democrats because he had opposed the Oslo Accords. And then I'll move fast forward to the Barack Obama years. He was the first president to show Democrats that you can stick it to Israel and we will still get 70% of the Jewish vote. He showed that he basically, I mean, to me, one of the biggest mistakes that we've always made as supporters of Israel was, instead of putting our faith in ourselves and putting faith in God we trust, we put all our trust in AIPAC, as if AIPAC was going to cure all our problems. I can't tell you how many people I spoke to in 2018 when you had the rise of AOC and Tlaib and Omar, and they said, well, AIPAC will take care of them. Okay, well, how'd that work out for you? Or they're just four voices. How'd that work out for you? Now AOC is given, and you saw her speaking at the convention. She's a rock star. She's a bad rock star, but she's a rock star nonetheless. So, from my contention, just moving forward, it was never just four voices. If you look at the Progressive Caucus in the Democrat Party, at least a third of them are progressives, and they're completely dominated, by J Street. So now my next fear is where do we move from here? We heard Kamala Harris speak at the convention. And as you said, no Jewish students were able to speak there. And even her and AOC, it was very platitude. Hostages, doesn't take a lot of courage to say, get the hostages out, but we must have a ceasefire. which to me has always been code for we have to let Hamas live. Get Israel out of Gaza, let Hamas live, let them regroup, let them rearm. And that to me has been a very, very, I don't know if it's where the Democrats want to go as a party, but their sympathy for Israel or their understanding of what Israel faces has been at best, appeasing us just to get the Jews to leave us alone and keep the Jewish vote and donors, in the party.
Sure. So we see that Trump right now is on track to receive more Jewish votes since Dwight Eisenhower, roughly 40 to 45%. That would be the most that any Republican has received in decades. I mean, it's truly extraordinary to see how the political alignments or the political ideologies of the American Jewish community have really shifted since October 7th. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the Democratic Party, yes, I do recall that when the AOC and Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were elected, the assurances were, well, the squad is quite small and the squad does not have political influences. And the squad in 2024 has tripled in size. And while it's true that Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, thank God, lost the primaries, you still have the squad in large numbers. AOC is a national Democratic figure. I mean, she just is. And her speech at the DNC was polished. It was articulate. It was in many cases universal. And that was deliberate because she has national ambitions. Look, something that really bothered me was Chuck Schumer, who often calls himself the guardian or protector of Israel. He used his speech to point to the blue lapel that he was wearing, standing up for anti-Semitism. The reality is, I would be much more thankful if Chuck Schumer brought the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act to a floor vote on the Senate, which of course he hasn't. I would be a lot more thankful if Chuck Schumer allowed Senate Democrats, who obviously control the Senate, to hold hearings on anti-Semitism, which of course they haven't done one. So I don't particularly care about the blue lapel. I don't care that Doug Emhoff's mother made brisket on Passover. I care about the policies that you will implement to combat a record rise in Jew hatred. And again, to their credit, the Trump campaign invited me and two other Jewish students to sit front row last week at Trump's Bedminster Golf Course while Trump laid out a new vision for not just the strengthening of the bilateral Israel-U.S. relationship, but also how to make college campuses safe again for all minority students. And why that has become a partisan issue, why that has become a political issue, I simply don't understand. The Democrats need to earn the Jewish vote. They need to make the case. I was at the DNC to hear that case being made, and I really did not hear much. I think the fact that they didn't platform a Jewish student is telling. But again, it goes beyond semantics and it goes beyond squabblings of who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. It goes to the core of the ideology of the Democratic Party. And if you look at their platform, they don't they don't mention what they're going to do for Jewish students who've been facing illegal discrimination at the hands of their universities. And I find that unacceptable. And I can't understand, with less than 80 days till the election, why my party hasn't come up with a comprehensive plan. And I would implore young Jewish Americans and certainly Jewish students to think about where their political ideologies ought to lie in November.
So something that I'll bring up to you also, in 2016, I think when Hillary was running against Trump, the DNC allowed both Bernie Sanders and Cornel West to sit on their platform committee. So they have been flirting with how they're going to get both the Jewish vote and the Palestinian vote. And again, it's a game you can't play. There's no such thing as, and this is something you hear from two-staters all the time. We support a Jewish democratic Israel and an independent Palestine. Now, what word is missing from the independent Palestine? The word democratic. And here's a question that's never been asked, and I'd love to see Peter Doocy ask this when next time there's a press conference with Karine Jean-Pierre. When did it become U.S. policy to create an undemocratic and anti-democratic state? Worse, as a state to a people, the Palestinian Authority, whose history is steeped in terrorism, and worse, right on Israel's border. Because remember, this whole thing about secure borders, Israel's border with Gaza was secure on October 6th. So this idea of promoting, again, and this is a J Street lingo here, a safe, secure, democratic Israel, independent Palestine, the two cannot go together. And this is something that's completely been missing from the conversation. Kamala mentioned it at the conference. And 2 weeks ago, I was watching Jews for Harris. on a Zoom call, and one of the speakers was Sharon Kleinbaum, a notorious, Israel basher. And one of the things that she said was that one of the reasons she likes Kamala is because she supports, I guess, recognizes Israel's right to exist, but that she also the liberation of Palestine. Now, the liberation of Palestine, again, I don't want, you're the guest here, so I want you to, speak more to this, but the liberation of Palestine is a very loaded and charged term.
Sure. So Congressman Brian Mast of Florida asked a similar question to a State Department official, essentially saying, well, if you believe in an independent state of Palestine, who have you objectively assessed would govern that state of Palestine? And she said, well, that's not up for us to decide, which of course is a way to evade the question, because an independent state of Palestine would almost guarantee to be run by a terrorist state. Gaza and the West Bank have a history, as you said, of terrorism. I mean, obviously you have Hamas in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority has a pay-to-slave policy where they reward families of terrorists. Needless to say that they are hopelessly corrupt. I want to get back to a point you mentioned earlier in terms of Kamala's speech and the ceasefire. I posted on social media a little bit of a joke, but I kind of mean it seriously. A ceasefire is not Beetlejuice. You can't say it 3 times and simply expect it to appear.
I saw that.
Right. So Hamas rejected the ceasefire agreement last week. So you can keep saying ceasefire, but the reality is when you have one half of the negotiating team who are saying, well, we're not going to agree to it, you have to go back to the drawing board. And why is there no ceasefire agreement? Well, it basically revolves around a 14-kilometer area between Gaza and Egypt, the Philadelphia corridor, which of course has been the focal point at which Egypt is able to smuggle in weapons and cash and ammunitions into Gaza, into Hamas's hands. And Israel, since its invasion on October 7th, something, of course, that Kamala Harris tried getting Israel not to do. In her infamous words, she, quote, studied the maps and said it would be impossible for Israel to take over Rafah and evacuate peacefully Gazan civilians, which, of course, Israel was able to do. I digress. Now, Israel cannot leave the Philadelphia corridor because that would allow Hamas to simply rearm itself, to regroup, and to refocus. Right now, Israel has Sinwar and has Hamas against a corner, and they would be foolish to back down. And I think the Western narrative is that war is always terrible and we need to end it as quick as possible. The reality is, unfortunately, sometimes wars have to be fought. World War II, the Allied involvement was a just involvement. It was the right thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do. And when you have a country that experienced the equivalent of 14 9/11s in one day, they have an obligation to make sure that their ideological or militaristic enemies cannot do that again. And simply saying ceasefire without mentioning how you will dismantle Hamas, how you will prevent October 7th from ever happening again, it's simply not possible. You need to make sure that Hamas can never again do what they did.
Shabbos, I know you've got a few minutes left, so one last question. You are the lead plaintiff against Harvard University for failing to protect Jewish students. Tell us, if you would, what suing a university is like and what exactly a victory is like. Is it to get them to say, yeah, we screwed up? Is it to get change policies, monetary compensation to Jewish students? How does it work?
Sure. So, I would just give a brief overview before I begin, which is to say that I think this conversation is connected to your previous question. Post October 7th, the Jewish people, and really anyone who cares about Western liberal democracy, who cares about American values, who cares about morality, they have a role to play in this fight. Now, the IDF is fighting our enemies on the air, the sea, and the land. Our fight is different, but it's no less important. We are fighting that in academia, in the halls of Congress, in the court of law, in the court of public opinion, on social media. And Harvard has normalized, accepted, and celebrated a culture and an environment of anti-Semitism. This was true before October 7th, and it was certainly true after October 7th. So we sued them on a couple of grounds, but the two most relevant are violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is a provision that prohibits an institution that receives federal dollars from discriminating against minority groups, specifically national origin. The Trump administration reclassified Judaism under the law. We are not only a religion, we are also an ethnicity, and therefore we are protected under the national origin provision, and also a breach of contract. When I give Harvard my tuition dollars, we expect not only a modicum amount of protection, but also educational opportunities, and we, of course, have not had that after October 7th. So our lawsuit, which is public, I encourage all your readers to encourage your listeners to read it. We asked a couple of things. So number one, of course, tuition reimbursements, of course, punitive damages. That goes without saying. But more fundamentally, we want there to be a comprehensive overview of the anti-Semitic political indoctrination that is ubiquitous in all too many classes at Harvard. We want there to be an independent third-party monitor to make sure Harvard is in compliance with its obligations under federal law. We want there to be a zero-tolerance policy on anti-Semitism in the same way there already is for other forms of bigotry, discrimination, and hatred. We want there to be mandatory Title IX training on anti-Semitism, again, in the same way there is for other forms of discrimination. And this is more lofty, I'll admit, but we want them to rescind the hundreds of millions of dollars they receive every single year from anti-democratic, anti-Western, anti-Semitic countries. And we're very proud of the lawsuit that we brought forth, and the judge agreed with us, at least initially, about 2-3 weeks ago. And he said, quote, "The facts as pledged show that Harvard failed its Jewish students." So we are going to trial. Harvard tried to dismiss our case with prejudice. They were, of course, unsuccessful, and they will be unsuccessful during the trial as well, because the facts are on our side. The evidence is on our side, and we will hold Harvard accountable for as long as it takes. We're not going anywhere.
Okay. Shabbos, it's been an absolute honor to have you. I wish you continued success. And I'm telling you, as somebody who was once in my 20s, went to college, they say that the young leader, the young students are the future of our country, and you certainly are the future of Jewish leadership. And I thank you for joining us. I wish you continued success and Hatzlacha and everything you're doing. And God willing, we'll talk to you again. Have a great
Amen.
night. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Pleasure.